Mayonnaise is a simple ingredient with a critical mission in professional kitchens. So why is selecting the right mayonnaise so complex? From extra heavy duty to real super premium, the category terminology causes unnecessary confusion. And the lack of standardization can lead to disappointing results, dissatisfied customers, and costly waste. Visit venturafoods.com/mayo needs to help you find the right mayonnaise for your operation.
Hello and welcome to Menu Talk with Pat and Brett. I'm your co-host, Brett Thorne, Senior Food and Beverage Editor of Nation's Restaurant News and Restaurant Hospitality. Regular members of our audience will know that my fellow co-host, Pat Kobe, Senior Menu Editor of Restaurant Business, usually joins me. But we're trying something new, focusing less on us and more on the fascinating guests that we have each week. So Pat will be on next week talking about her guest, and I will introduce you to mine, Marc Sheehan. Marc is the chef of Northern Spy, a restaurant in Canton, Massachusetts, located in the first copper rolling mill ever built in the United States. It was run by Paul Revere. Revere was known as a silversmith, but after the War for Independence, he became a bit of an industrialist, and he brought the new British technology of copper rolling to the United States. To do that, he sent his son, Joseph Warren Revere, to England under an assumed name to get trained in the process. That bit of industrial espionage is why the restaurant is called Northern Spy. Marc previously had a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Loyal 9, which was named for a group of colonial-era revolutionaries. It focused on New England dishes that had largely been forgotten over the years. Northern Spy isn't quite as cerebral, and you can get Massachusetts staples such as clam chowder and steak tips and other things that you don't need to be a historian to appreciate. But if you do happen to be one, you'll probably catch some of the other culinary choices that Marc Sheehan and his crew have made at his restaurant. And I had a chance to discuss those choices with him and other aspects of old New England cooking. I hope you enjoy our conversation. You do a lot of anthropological kind of cooking, I'm going to call it, right? You like seek what was in New England and you well, I don't know. You tell me. What do you do?
I've never phrased it that way, but I think that's a perfect way to phrase it, because it's not just finding old recipes and recreating them. Actually, a lot of the recipes are where a lot of the inaccuracy comes from. Like if you think about now, like Martha Stewart writes a cookbook for an audience, and she's also trying to put out in the world like who Martha Stewart is. Like you're following her brand, and the same thing was happening with the Fannie Farmer cookbook or the Mrs. Lincoln cookbook, that they were being written for a certain audience group that had a degree of economic power that allowed them to purchase ingredients or even have people cooking for them in their home. And so it's not what everyone was eating. There's a great museum up in New Hampshire called Strawberry Bank that has dooryard gardens, and like they're very accurate to how things were planted and why. But if you look at it, it's like they were planting coriander and they were planting basil, and they're, New England was one of the largest producers and consumers of cayenne pepper in the 19th century. But it's really not in the food when you read recipes. But why would we have it? Why would we be growing it? So it's people were eating that at home. That's what they're using because they couldn't buy expensive spices. So I think to call it anthropological is fairly accurate. That like I'm trying to look at the time period, what people were buying at markets, what ingredients were available, why they were purchasing them, as well as looking at some of those kind of more interesting recipes or menus, particularly from the 19th century, that I think just allows me to make choices as opposed to necessarily try to like accurately recreate the dish that I'm reading in a cookbook.
So you're looking at what was available back then and what could have been cooked, and then you're like, okay, 21st century, I'm going to, use that as inspiration, but not necessarily try to create a museum. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think there's a lot of regions that have great terroir, right? That like their food developed as a result of what was growing, the waves of migration coming to the area, and that was informing choices that were made, and then dishes that became favorites, that became part of the culture. So I think when you look at what how New England food evolved and why, and the forces that kind of co-opted it, it's something where like I felt like I missed out on something. That like you look at these great food traditions around the world, and when I was in my late teens and 20s, as I was sort of figuring out a little bit what actually happened here, I realized like I've lived here my whole life. I never ate this stuff, and if I did, it usually wasn't good because they weren't the original versions where there was care in the sourcing and care in preparation, care in the seasoning. That is what kind of launched me into it. And then now I would say that like I've tried to take the approach of just the more stuff I can pour into my brain about this is why I make choices and this is how, even if I'm just coming up with a special because I found kohlrabi at the farmer's market, I'm still just inherently making these choices that I hope speaks to a certain degree of like New England terroir, for lack of a better term.
Well, it's also interesting that they were growing things like cayenne pepper and coriander in the 19th century when it wasn't, certainly it's not how I think of New England food as being spicy or seasoned. I mean, I love New England food, but it's, in my experience, it's seafood and not doing too much to it, if you know what I mean.
Correct. And I think, but if you look at some of the later versions of some of these dishes, it's like if you're going to make like a stuffing for a baked scrod, there's oftentimes a pinch of cayenne in it. But so they were growing it, cayenne, for example, they were growing it to dry it because it was a cheaper alternative to importing pepper from further afield. But I would have to think that somebody was chopping one up and eating it fresh at some point. I don't see it in the record, but you would think it just would have had to happen. Same with coriander, that they were growing varieties that were more for the seed, but like the greens and the flowers and things like that, they taste great. So you would think that it had to have found its way into the food. It just didn't necessarily always find its way into the historical record of it. That's a point I've tried to make sometimes, that like we oftentimes use, large whole herbs in food, and we've sort of shied away from some of that more familiar, like New England kind of cookie spicing and things, because I think having those big punchy, bold, fresh flavors is not oftentimes associated with the food. But if you read a lot of how they cooked and why, it's there. It's very simple. It's very almost like what's happening in modern British food today, is that it's purity of ingredient, purity of cooking technique, and then season it very simply and let everything shine. There was still a holdover of some of the like medieval era of cooking where you were just piling tons and tons of ingredients onto things, but it kind of phased out. And even like if you look at baked beans or you look at brown bread, they went through this very strange transformation that was a result of the region becoming more wealthy, as well as, so now they had access to more ingredients. They had access to more sweeteners, which started to become almost looked at as in vogue by wealthier classes. And then also there were these kind of xenophobic nativist forces at the time, sort of Civil War, post-Civil War, that decided one way in which we can tell people this is how you eat as an American is by defining what American food was. And because New England was sort of like looked at as the oldest part of the country, and the part of the country that frankly had won the Civil War, had been a big part of the revolution, it was looked at as like, we should define what it is to eat American food. And that's when you started seeing things like baked beans become Boston baked beans, or where they had to define it by attaching the regional title to it. And then the recipes changed accordingly.
And wasn't there also sort of puritanical is historically inaccurate but in the 19th century, people like the Kellogg's and other assholes were like, no, you shouldn't have spicy food. You shouldn't be using these things. You have to be pure and clean and focus on also the Industrial Revolution. So feed a growing workforce with starch and fat and, so that they could labor and not spend so much money on delicious things like spices and herbs that it turns out are super good for you, but we didn't know. I mean, is that accurate? That's what was going on at the time?
I think so. I think we have the reputation as being a little uptight. And so I think that played a role. I definitely agree with you that there were economic forces at work. You look at something like baked beans and brown bread, that like you had parts of Massachusetts out by like the Connecticut River Valley that actually considered themselves to be like the center of New England. And they took offense at Boston being called like, the hub. And so they found like, and you can read it in people's letters or descriptions of like when they first ate baked beans that had molasses in it, that they were outraged by it, that they wouldn't have fed it to their pigs because to them it was beans and pork is what was the dish. It was that's what you were going for, is that really rich, savory flavor. And you wanted each bean, I think the phrase was something like an elector, that each, or like a voter, that each bean like mattered and had a voice in the finished dish, as opposed to this gloppy sweet mess. And whereas like Boston, it seemed like kind of went off the rails a little bit with, we're rich, we got money, let's just start throwing things into a pot. And to me, you mentioned the anthropological aspect of it. It's all these forces competing all the time against each other that I think really created and defined a certain cuisine. But then it's like, it's not what you see presented as modern or current New England food. It got that bad reputation because we kind of intentionally forgot that there were multiple different versions of it based off of where you were located, the choices you were making, who employed you, and what they were telling you could or could not eat. Yeah.
Well, and Boston obviously was an important port, and so a lot of molasses, I'm sure, was being imported from the Caribbean to be turned into rum and so on and so forth. So that
Yeah, it was around. They had it, and so I think when you have that abundance of something, it's inevitably going to find its way into the food. And you look at, as you transition into different parts of New England, you see less brown sugar and molasses and more maple syrup and things like that, which that nowadays doesn't sound that exciting. But to me, those were some of those discoveries of like, oh, there were real choices being made for a reason. It wasn't to attract tourists by saying, these are Maine baked beans. It's because when you're out in a logging camp, these are the choices you make based off of, the economic factors, what's around, what stores well, what you can keep on hand. And so that now it seems like, oh, we're going to take a ride up to Maine. And now that baked beans have maple syrup in it, but like it really was coming from a foodways place of really intentional choices. Yeah.
That was the sweetener they had, so
Yep.
they used it.
Yeah.
Well, and there's no way in hell those people with their gardens weren't also using coriander leaves and stems and everything else. They weren't wasting anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. You look at how people cooked vegetables, and certainly like as time progressed, there was a time where a salad was invented, essentially, because you didn't have clean water. And so how are you going to clean the lettuce? How are you going to clean the herbs? So frequently those things did get cooked because it was the safer way to consume it. One of the reasons that vinegar ends up on salads is because it kills a lot of bacteria, vinegar and salt. So the seasoning on something, if you're going to eat it raw, was determined by trying to keep it food safe. And then over time, as we've gotten better with having clean water and being able to clean fresh vegetables, we then dialed back the seasoning a little bit, balanced it out more. And so I think that's, there was that bit of like New England was the frontier once for Europeans who came here, and that informed why a lot of things were cooked aggressively or boiled or had to be salted and preserved or dried before it ended up in the food. And I do think that at a certain point, when you no longer have to eat that way, you're going to choose not to.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that some of those things didn't stick around more than they did, but I think it resulted in like we built up a certain degree of wealth and technology over time that allowed us to start to move away from some of these things that now, when you look back on it, they seem hip and they're cutting edge and they're right on the forefront of what everyone is doing in modern restaurants. But it was just what people did and needed to do to survive and create a pantry,
You mean like how everyone's into fermenting and making pickles and stuff these days?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Or charcuterie, things like that.
Yes, preserving food so that it's safe and you don't die.
Right.
Or starve.
Right. And honestly, it often now, you're finding out there's so many more nutritional benefits to a lot of it too, that it probably kept you healthier to a degree when you didn't have access to fresh food. But I think those are things that over time, like I like the word fermented to me isn't necessarily always a delicious sounding phrase on a menu, but we would, for example, make a ton of sauerkraut, and it's a tough sell to necessarily like put on a side of sauerkraut on the menu. But it becomes a seasoning agent that we use. The brine is something that ends up in different dishes or breads or stuff like that. So it's a background flavor. It's a thing that informs choices we make in terms of how we're going to season food or order. But it comes from that place of like, this was around, people were using it. They had cabbage they needed to harvest. They needed to make sure that it went through the winter. And so now I have a acidity and umami that I can put into a dish,
I've been experimenting with sour cabbage, ironically, as a condiment because I now live in Brighton Beach in the South
Okay.
Brooklyn, so there are a lot of Eastern Europeans. There's a lot of cabbage and stuff, and it's a delicious seasoning. Just sprinkling
Yeah.
it with stuff, it's great.
One of the great benefits at Northern Spy was getting the ability to cook over wood, because I would read a lot of recipes, particularly older ones that were more like primary source documents as opposed to cookbooks, and there were techniques or things being done to the food that I just like couldn't wrap my head around why they were doing it. And like, for example, if you're going to roast a large joint of meat, it would be getting brushed with this paste of like butter and eggs and breadcrumbs, and you would just keep sort of like basting it. And it had herbs, but it didn't necessarily seem to be like adding much to the dish or informing much to the dish. But once I started cooking stuff like that, I was realizing the amount of airflow that was happening and evaporation of things, and that it was essentially being done to like keep it moist. That if there was going to be scorching, you would burn the breadcrumb mix and you could take that off. But it was really there to protect the product you were cooking.
It's like wrapping it in aluminum foil.
Exactly. Like they didn't have the ability to sous vide it or to, it's how like the original pies were really just transportation vessels as opposed to meant to eat the crust. But the other thing I realized is that there's so much of this food when you're looking at how simple it is or basic, or that there's very little seasoning, you're missing the ingredient of the wood fire and of that little bit of smoke or maybe a little bit of char that really does transform things. And I think you take an ingredient like cabbage and it's like, how great is grilled cabbage? Like it completely changes it from something that's just boiled or blanched or shaved raw. And not too long ago, we would grill half heads of cabbage, char them a little bit and get some smoke. Then we would turn them into sauerkraut. It's a different thing. I mean, it's like,
That sounds good.
oh yeah, man. And
Mhm.
like we made mustard with it. We were making almost like an onion dip type of thing with it. I mean, but it was just that simple step of like getting a little bit of char on it, then letting it go through that process. It's like, it's a totally different ingredient. Yeah.
But let's talk about the food at Northern Spy and how your own, historiographical background is reflected on the food at your restaurant.
We do have clam chowder on our menu, something that I never would do before. We have things like steak tips. We have a great burger. But then we also, dry age whole ducks, and we roast them above the fire and serve it with like beets that we char right over the embers and a rhubarb butter. So there's certain dishes that I would describe as just like words on a page. And then there's other dishes that are very much like, these are our steak tips with peppers and onions. We have macaroni and cheese that I hate baked macaroni and cheese. I've always found it dry and gloppy, and the pasta's oftentimes overcooked. The one great thing is the crust on top. I was more of a Kraft Blue Box kid growing up. I like that almost like Alfredo style saucy mac and cheese. So looking at original recipes, that you're seeing both, but many of them had, because you were cooking it over an open fire, were baked. They had a crust. And so the way we made ours is we actually built it like lasagna, where there's layers of like long ziti-like noodles with lasagna sheets, and we bake that separate, chill it, and then we can cut a slice and sear it on a plancha. And then we basically just rest that in a large pool of the sauce. And so as you break it apart, it's really only held together by cheese and bechamel. or Mornay. As you break it up, it now transforms itself into that, saucy macaroni and cheese. So we still get the texture, but then we get like the saucy pasta, which I prefer. So it's still mac and cheese, but we're trying to make some of those choices to really give you an improved or elevated version of it, or something you're familiar with, but you can't get anywhere else.
Now, your other restaurant was Loyal 9 in Cambridge, right?
Correct. And it should be a Tuesday night where you can pop in, just have dinner while your kids are at gymnastics. Or Saturday night, it's a special occasion. You can come down and we have the ability to do both, right? That it can be very casual and you can pop in and sit at the bar and get a sandwich, or you can sit down and, like I said, get a dried steak or a duck or a chicken that we roast whole over the fire. I think when I look at things like steak tips, it's like those are, I researched where they came from. I still don't necessarily have a definitive answer, but I'm pretty sure it came from Greek immigrants that started coming to the United States in the 20th century. And that, I even sort of traced it back a bit to where you started seeing them show up on menus in restaurants in Boston, but they were oftentimes called en brochette instead of a steak tip. And so you have places like the Hilltop that claim that they invented them, but like you could find stuff around here that predates the Hilltop steak tip that is a steak tip, because they were oftentimes served with a similar marinade and with a similar garnish, like potatoes or rice pilaf, something like that. So, but you are correct. I mean, they are New England food. They're just slightly further away from the time period that I was focusing on earlier. But they are uniquely us, and they came from a wave of immigration that tried to figure out a way to become part of the fabric of New England. And one of the ways that they did that was they started opening restaurants and they started serving their community. And eventually things that they were making caught on and were appropriated and became more part of, like you said, you can get them at every bar and grill, but there was a time where they were brand new,
And Greek, I had no idea.
I'm sure there's going to be some culinary historian who says I'm wrong, but in the research I had, I found Boston tourism menu books from, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where I could sort of track it appearing on menus over time. And it seemed like it went from a point of if you were a good restaurant in the city, you had a beef tenderloin brochette or a beef sirloin en brochette that came with a simple starch and usually something like peppers or onions. Yeah.
And a brochette just means on a skewer. So
Correct.
There you go. So how is New England's heritage now reflected on the menu at Northern Spike?
Well, I think some of it, they're kind of quiet choices, like I mentioned. Like, for example, we have an appetizer that's essentially shrimp scampi. Shrimp, we sear it in a cast iron pan. It comes with toast, but we make instead of it just being like garlic and white wine, we buy as many cayenne peppers as we can get our hands on in the summer. We dry them above and smoke them above the fire to get us through the year. We grind it up, and then we make like a chili garlic butter. And then, your normal shrimp scampi, you would deglaze your pan maybe with white wine, deglaze with some cream sherry, kind of that nod to like your Newburgh or your sauce Americaine, those sort of like lobstery sauces that you probably could get at Phillips Old Colony. So if you eat it, it's a slightly spicy shrimp scampi. And the words on the menu are just cast iron shrimp, with chili garlic butter. But the choices are to reflect the heritage. And if people ask where it came from, we can let them know. But really, it's just a shrimp appetizer.
You said that there's a certain population or group of people who in Canton.
So in Canton, definitely we have a significant like Italian American and Irish American population here. And so that's reflected on the menu as well. So we do have things like a gnocchi, but they're actually more like we originally called them potato dumplings on the menu because they're not a gnocchi. It's more like a potato cake that we bind with potato flour. There's a little bit of mascarpone cheese and sour cream in it. And then we sear them, and they almost sort of look like a little scallop. But honestly, when we called it a potato dumpling, it didn't sell. No one would order it. And so the day that we finally changed it to call it gnocchi, because my fear had been calling it gnocchi and it not presenting as gnocchi would have been the problem. As soon as we called it gnocchi, it started flying and has been well received. And I think that little twist that we put on it has served it well. That there is a surprise. It's something where, for me, there's kind of a New England pasta tradition, but it's more dumpling based, or it's when things like, nondescript macaroni started coming over from Italy. So that was really what we were trying to do there. But honestly, the choice was like, let's call it gnocchi. It's gnocchi. It comes with a lamb ragu, where we, cook whole lamb necks over the fire, and then we braise them down, pick the meat off, and then cook it down in sort of a spicy tomato sauce with like a little bit of harissa paste. There's nothing there that I think jumps out at you as coming from colonial America, but the choice of the little potato, like a simple potato cake, I think is still our nod to it, but it really works well for the community that we're in.
When I would assume colonial New England had sheep, and
they did, and absolutely, like the choice of the cut that we're using, that's a tough cut that requires slow roasting or braising, has a lot of connective tissue. It results in a better dish. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And as you said, there was chili, even though somewhere along the line in New England, you guys forgot about chili.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And oddly, I mean, I have a ton of tomatoes that do great in my backyard. Maybe not a lot of fresh tomato salads or tomato sauces, but we liked, there was a lot of ketchup in food at a certain point, probably because of the sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. And because it was preserved in everything.
Shelf stable.
Yeah. All of that. And so what are some of the menu items that you like the most, or are most proud of, or you think are most interesting at Northern Spy?
I think, honestly, like the shrimp dish I mentioned is something I'm very proud of, mostly because of that technique of, that we're able to accomplish finding the exact pepper we want. It's grown locally from Tangerini's farm. We dry it over our fire, and then it really informs the flavor of like a pretty simple, approachable appetizer. I like those things are the things that I get super excited by. Truly, like I do think our steak tips are probably some of the best you can get around here. I've like a true obsession with Worcestershire sauce. So it's very Worcestershire forward. I think the dishes that if you come in and you get something that's coming from the fire where it really shows it off, like I mentioned our duck earlier, there's a lot of work that just goes into processing the ducks and having them ready for service and dry aging them, but like just cooking a beautiful piece of meat on the bone that has a little bit of fat that's picking up the flavor of the fire, I think is something that like you can't get that at most restaurants. And so if you're going to come visit us, looking, asking your server, what are the things that are coming right off the flame, I think is, particularly if it's the only time you'll be here, is something people should look at. Like I hate salmon. I've hated it pretty much my whole life. Just the smell of overcooked salmon will make my stomach turn. Raw smoked, I'm fine, but like cooked salmon, I just find repulsive. We've had a salmon dish on our menu that we cook with crispy skin over the fire, and it's something that like it's probably the only piece of salmon I can eat. But it just in the 6-7 minutes that it's over the flame cooking and the skin's crisping up, it just really the fat in the fish really picks up the flavor of the grill nicely. I'm actually very proud of our cooks when we get 1 or 2 pieces of fish sent back for being undercooked a night, because it shows they're really trying to nail it. And so it's like, I think we cook the fish really well. The garnish will change with it over time. Right now it's with this sort of like spicy sesame vinaigrette, a little head of lettuce that we grill right on the coals, and some rainbow carrots that we glaze in cider and a little bit of miso. And so it's like the accompaniments change, but the fish really hasn't changed much. Yeah.
Well, all that sounds like New England food. And even though most of your customers probably aren't that fascinated by the history and they just want some nice shrimp with garlic, there is a background to it. And if they're curious, you can tell them about it.
And I hope that on our best day and our worst day that like that's what we accomplish. That like it feels like you're rooted in the area, in the region, that whether it's spring, summer, or fall, or coldest day in winter, you really feel like you're in New England. And that if you have no interest in any of that whatsoever and you just want your food to be delicious and come out quickly, and have an honest portion size, I hope we nail that too.
Magic. Well,
Yeah.
It was a pleasure talking with you, Marc Sheehan, and I hope
You
to
as well.
do it in real life.
Mayonnaise is a simple ingredient with a critical mission in professional kitchens. So why is selecting the right mayonnaise so complex? From extra heavy duty to real super premium, the category terminology causes unnecessary confusion. And the lack of standardization can lead to disappointing results, dissatisfied customers, and costly waste. Visit venturafoods.com/mayo needs to help you find the right mayonnaise for your operation.